Good afternoon, everybody. The intention of my talk this afternoon is to explore a little bit some of the common ground and differences between the Sociocratic Circle method and Sociocracy 3.0, and also to look a bit at what I would call unique value propositions of S3. So what does S3 bring distinct from Sociocratic Circle method, or I might say classic sociocracy at times. And this has been an interesting inquiry for me that I've put off for a long time and just mentioned bits and pieces. And actually last night and this morning, I sat down to really see if I could find some answers to the questions. So what I'm going to share with you is by no means meant to be comprehensive, but it's just my kind of first take based on my experience and understanding of SCM and S3. SCM, by the way, is abbreviation for Sociocratic Circle method, and S3 abbreviation for Sociocracy 3.0. So for any of you who didn't know, I'm James Priest. My colleague Bernard has been on the conference today sharing about the S3 Canvas series and also what S3 brings to SCM. And I'm also here in my motor caravan with Lily, who's my dear beloved and also my working partner. And so she's been in the background inputting a bit on this presentation. So let's jump in and see where we get within the time frame today. So first up, are you going to be able to see this with the with this box in the side? Let's put you right over there, folks. Okay, so first up, S3, well, maybe just to say briefly about the history. So I was introduced to Sociocratic Circle method in 2001, back in the day when there was one web page available in English about Sociocratic Circle method, and I had a hand-typed document that came to me via Australia to the UK. And with those two documents, I learned quite a bit about sociocracy and interpreted it through my own lens, which at the time was working around subpersonalities as an integrative counselor with adults and young people. And kind of, so one aspect that I noticed back then in 2001 was that sociocracy was inviting an intentional container where people could come together who wished to collaborate and could share different and sometimes diverse perspectives, and rather than polarizing into a kind of binary A-B thinking, who's right, who's wrong, instead by like hearing the different voices could find the essential value in everybody's voice. Yeah, and there's something, if you've experienced that, there's something, I wouldn't call it magic, but it's an energetic phenomena that when you have that discipline to refrain from polarizing one way or the other, it tends to reveal new perspectives. And I often call this the emergence of wisdom, and we could say both and thinking. And the other thing about sociocracy, I think, is in essence, it's a philosophy that says, let's ensure that people affected by decisions are able to make and or at least influence those decisions. So we're talking about collaborative or at least participatory decision making in terms of decisions that affect human beings. And the other thing about S3 is it integrates also the mindset of agile and lean thinking and a lot of patterns and practices from there. And if you're unfamiliar with agile and lean, it's beyond the scope of this conversation, but I would encourage you to dive in there and check some of that out, because there's some really great practices for effectively generating value and eliminating waste that are being utilized in many contexts around the world today, and particularly tech. So one commonality we can observe with SCM and S3 is they both facilitate alignment of activity towards common objectives. Yeah, but the objects of alignment differ, and I'm going to pick up a bit more on that later in this presentation when I get to differences. Another common thing is that people delegate influence throughout a network of interlinked domains. And so, you know, if you're trying to command and control 1,000 people, it's not going to go well, because it's just too complex, you know, like their needs, their personal aspirations, ambitions, interests, areas of activity in each moment. So it's common sense to decentralize to a degree influence. And so it's quite important, if you do that, that you don't end up with lots of silos through a system. So this idea of linking between domains is integral to SCM and also to S3. And we could think of that as like the building blocks of organizational structure. And the way I find helpful to think about organizational structure is a structure that facilitates the flow of information and influence in the most effective way to then facilitate the maximum creation of value. Yeah, so organizational structure is just a way to flow information and influence. And it's really useful to start by asking that question: where does information and influence need to flow? And what's the path of least resistance and most direct transmission for that to happen? That's going to reveal a lot for you about how to structure a specific organization depending on its unique context. And what's interesting about domains is, in terms of delegating influence, they're defined by the delegator. Yeah, both in SCM and in S3. And what that really means is a domain is like a domain of semi-autonomy and accountability to act. Yeah, so if I take it on, I'm accountable for that. I'm autonomous within the constraints of that domain. And if I supersede those constraints, I need to have a conversation with somebody or somebodies. And the more clearly domains are defined, the more free people can be to act. And the more effective we are at linking between domains, the more we are able to enable decentralization and autonomy of people. And in my opinion, good collaborative governance leads to less collaborative governance. And what I mean by that is we want to free each human being up as much as possible to decide and do for themselves. For me, this is the bottom line of good governance: freeing people up to decide and do as much as possible for themselves, and understanding when there's a need for a conversation with somebody else. So, other commonalities: decisions are made by those that are accountable for the domain by consent. So consent from an S3 point of view, we say the absence of reasons not to. So it's like doing appropriate things in the absence of reasons not to. And if you see reasons not to, then figure that out and change what you are doing to integrate that wisdom, because you're going to have a better day and be more effective. And people are selected and delegated accountability by consent. So that's very powerful when peers decide who shall be accountable for what on the strength of reason. It helps us play to the talents, strengths, and competencies that we have. And it also enables buy-in of people for other people to be wherever they are, and for us to keep fluidity and move people around according to changing needs. So another thing, objections are paramount. This was a very interesting concept for me when I learned about SCM, this idea of supremacy to argument. So it's not supremacy to an individual or to the majority or to the person who shouts the loudest or who blocks. It's supremacy to an argument that demonstrates risk of harm or ways to improve. And the way that we resolve objections in S3 is slightly different. And for me, it was an improvement on what I found a bit more ambiguous with SCM throughout the years I was sharing about that, which, by the way, was quite extensively. I'm pretty busy teaching S3 these days, but in 2014, I had about 15 courses and another 20 or so engagements teaching SCM. So I was a pretty big advocate for that in the world. Sociocracy, SCM and S3 invites both and thinking, which I mentioned already. And one of the attractions for me back in 2001 when I came across it, although the conversation around integral and Thiel wasn't so much in the collective at that time, was this idea that maybe as human beings, we have the potential to view the world beyond a dualistic mindset. And Ken Wilber said something very interesting to me. He said, nobody is smart enough to be 100% wrong. And some people are more correct than others. And what that says to me is, there's always something of value in what everybody brings, and we would do well to pay attention to that and to recognize that rather than dismissing somebody out of hand. And that for me has been a profound teaching in my life. It seems to be a profound realization for others who are struggling in the more binary dual world consciousness. And it excites me the possibility of extending that wider, not just to the adults, but also through education to our children that follow. So let's get on to a few differences. So Sociocratic Circle method, until recently, and I think this is changing, has really advocated for whole system implementation. You know, it's like you do the whole thing, and I understand the arguments for this because they all fit together and it kind of makes sense. And in my opinion, it makes sense by degree, and it really depends on context. And whilst in an ideal world, in certain contexts, SCM might make a lot of sense. In reality, when human beings get to it, there's all kinds of reasons why whole system implementation is impeded in different ways. And so I've worked with numerous organizations, advocated for whole system implementation for many years. And what I've observed is while a few do that and maybe sustain it, the majority don't. And what they tend to do is adapt and evolve it over time according to their unique context. That's exactly the case with Edinburgh Electrotechnique, like the first organization where SCM was evolved, and it's the case in many, many other organizations besides. And I think that we do well to recognize that and just be honest about that. And what S3 offers is a pull system for change, which isn't perfect either, because it basically says if there's an area of need that you can identify, take a look at the patterns of S3, and if there's something useful for you, which there probably will be, then you can pull that in and experiment with it. The problem with that is it doesn't kind of mandate a whole collection of patterns, and therefore people don't necessarily understand the utility and value of synthesis of some of these patterns. However, the degree to which people feel safe and open to explore an optional menu of patterns versus suggestions of a mandatory implementation of a whole methodology, in my experience, it's proving far more attractive. And there are many thousands of people in the last 3 years since we started introducing S3 who are pulling in patterns today, including, I heard John Buck mentioning ING earlier and KBC, and we've got a few people from Molecular Partners on the call today, and Champala Neuroscience Program, and Volvo, IKEA, to name just a few. And these are big organizations that have struggles, and what they're doing is starting with their area of greatest need and pulling in those things that seem most relevant with those people most inspired to try. And that seems to be a very effective way for these patterns to be integrated, experimented with, and spread. So, other differences. In general, and again, I think it's changing, but if you look at the traditional approach to implementing SCM, then you start with training people around how to make and evolve decisions together. And then you design and implement a circle structure, and you start running with that. And as I mentioned in the last slide there with S3, what we're finding is, you know, when people reach out for something, usually they have an area of need. And that's a great start, because it's people saying, yes, we want to search for something different, and we see the utility in it because what we currently do isn't good enough. And so being able to introduce patterns that can help there, and over time that lead to changes in the system, which in turn leads to an organic evolution of the organizational structure, again, seems to make sense for people, and it eliminates a lot of waste, because it kind of enables what's got greatest utility to occur and reduces the potential for getting sidetracked down options that are maybe less appropriate. The other thing is around alignment. So I mentioned earlier that SCM and S3 both facilitate alignment towards common objectives, but SCM invites alignment towards realizing a vision and delivering aims. And I think aims has, for many people, been a tricky concept to define, and I, along with others, had a go at that in different moments. But the way I understand them essentially is deliverables in terms of products and services, and we could also say experiences, transformations, and raw materials, as I learned from Nathaniel Whitestone, a TSG consultant many years ago. But the thing about a deliverable is it's designed to kind of feed something. It's designed to facilitate some kind of change towards realizing the vision. And what we realized quite early on with S3 was that behind vision and behind aims and behind actually every single thing we ever do as human beings from birth to death is what we call a driver. And what we mean by driver, I'm not sure if I added that to the, I think we'll come to the definition of that a little later actually when I talk about unique value propositions. But basically, like the motive for an organization to begin with. Other differences, SCM advocates for operational leaders of groups who are selected by the higher circle, and this is considered mandatory and essential. And I would challenge that, actually. I mean, in my experience, I've worked with many teams and many networks of teams where there is no specifically dedicated leader, and leadership is distributed throughout everybody, and that alone is not a good idea. But if you look today towards agile and lean, and you look at some of the practices and patterns people have for coordinating work, combined with the value of making and evolving agreements by consent and developing skill sets in doing that collaboratively and in a participative way, then it's not always indicated actually that leadership is necessary. But that leadership is necessary in everybody, and everybody takes on the accountability of that. Other obvious differences, I think, are that SCM has 2 or 3 values, depending on who you talk to. And I know Diana Leaf Christian, who was a mentor of mine, she used to speak a lot of transparency, effectiveness, and equivalence. And more recently, SOFA have dismissed transparency as not fundamental, effectiveness and equivalence as being like the 2 primary values. Bernard and I decided when we were putting together S3 that actually we wouldn't talk about values at all in terms of our opinion on what people should value, because we observe that human beings, the first place human beings polarize is on the basis of values, and behind values are people's deeply rooted beliefs, and people's deeply rooted beliefs are built around their experiences of what brought them harm or what brought them well-being in their lives. And so starting with a conversation of values can be sensitive, whereas principles are more like fundamental kind of rules of how things work and or guidelines for how people behave. And we said, well, if people value the principles, then they can adopt them as values for themselves, but let's talk about principles rather than values. And on that note, in SCM, obviously the 3 or 4 principles are the organizing circles, link between circles, select people by consent, and make and evolve decisions by consent. And we actually kind of pivoted on that and began to define those practices more as patterns, alongside numerous other patterns. And in S3, as those of some of you may be aware, there's currently 70 patterns, including one called choose or decide on values, which enables people to decide on their own organizational values. So SCM predefined values is essential to adopt, and what S3 suggests is the principles are helpful to adopt, and there's a pattern called Adopt the 7 Principles. And in my personal opinion, all of those principles make radical sense, and as a species we would all do well to try to align our lives according to that for the rest of our existence, and that's going to be a good thing. However, that doesn't mean to say that other people share that opinion or have come to that, let's say, we're an insight and a realization that they haven't yet arrived there. And so trying to spoon feed people my opinion about what's better for them and for me and for others isn't necessarily respectful of where they currently are. And I like to say true compassion is allowing others to suffer in the way they choose. And whilst that might be challenging sometimes and we have to deal with the consequences, it's definitely worthwhile to think about. Other obvious differences, the norms from SCM. Some people don't even know that there are norms because they're published under copyright and they're quite difficult to access and discover. And the practical guide in S3 is published under Creative Commons license because, in my opinion, there's no excuse for anything to stand in the way of the transmission of these practices at a time that's so critical for us as a species. And we should be doing everything we can to spread as far and wide this wisdom and these practices as we possibly can. And I want to be able to answer to the children that follow and say that I did my absolute best to do that, despite my sympathies for why maybe TSG would decide to maintain copyright and also certification, of course, which in my experience, not being certified is a prerequisite for acknowledgement and endorsement by TSG as a sociocracy expert. And I think that has merit by degree and also as a tragedy at the same time. And with S3, we're looking as it spreads about how to preserve quality and integrity of S3 and transmission over time. And we have currently the intentional commitment of practitioners and teachers, which offers some guidelines around that. And we have numerous other elements that we intend to bring online in the coming months and years ahead. Bernard mentioned in his talk, SCM is an empty method for organizational governance. And S3 is opinionated. we basically omit any patterns that can hinder or break self-organization from happening, which is why you won't find a leader pattern in SCM, but it doesn't discount the possibility of people having leaders. So we have the role pattern there. So there are many ways you can utilize S3 to evolve organizations that are less self-organizing. I think in some cases that is profoundly appropriate, and I'm not an advocate for universal self-organization at all times, but we don't want to encourage anybody who didn't understand the difference yet by offering patterns that would detract them from the possibility of realizing self-organization, which is ultimately the most effective way to handle complexity, especially when you scale up to large organizations and the social level. So, a couple more differences. People responding to issues arising in the course of delivering aims to realize a vision. So, issues was the term until recently with SCM. And in S3, I mentioned already, people respond to organizational drivers. I'm quite interested to see that Jennifer and Jerry in their new book now are talking about needs statements. And that's interesting because I had this conversation originally with Victor Gomolsky when we were looking at developing sociocratic software in 2014, and he said, man, needs are missing from the sociocracy narrative, and he kind of explained that to me, and so when we developed S3, we started to play around with that, and we toyed with the idea of need statements, but we realized a driver isn't just a need, because there's a context and there's an occurrence, there's like something happening, and there's also the relationship to that occurrence of the people who are involved with it, and the driver kind of involves all three of those. And so this is why we dropped the term need statement and came up with drivers and driver statement instead. I'm going to whiz through this a little bit because I realize the time is kind of short. So qualified objections, reasons why doing something stands in the way of my ability to work, deliver value to the aim, or is beyond my range of tolerance, and let's not get into the subtleties and overlap of those two. And in S3, we came up with a very specific way to qualify objections, which is basically by asking the question, how does doing this stand in the way of the effective or more effective flow of value to any organizational driver? And anybody in an organization, from an S3 point of view, can raise objections to anybody when they see reason to do so. And when we're considering a decision in one particular domain, we do well to tap the collective understanding of the wider organization and just check, is this going to cause harm anywhere? Or is there a way we can change this that would help us improve how value flows elsewhere in the system, not just here? And that's quite helpful as a way to move forward. And I really appreciate that. And I think that's a real evolution and brings a lot of clarity for people around qualifying objections. We tend to resolve objections one at a time. So those of you familiar with that process in SCM, often you collect them first, group them, and then resolve them one at a time. I personally find the other much more effective. And we've tested that many, many hundreds of times now, and it's universally effective. So I'm happy to speak with anyone in another moment about the reasons behind that. And depending on who you ask, in SCM, there's no distinction made between objections and concerns. And with S3, we make a big distinction between objections and concerns. So a concern can't be qualified, but must at least be noted and reviewed in the evaluation, and or considered post-celebration of having reached a good enough for now and safe enough to try agreement. And I really thank Diana Leaf Christian for that, because it was from her that I learned this distinction, and I'm a bit concerned when I see it omitted, because I really think it helps us to avoid slipping into discrete consensus, especially with groups who are less familiar with being able to tell the difference. And finally, just a few UVPs for S3, in my opinion. So the concept of driver, which, as I said, it's basically like a personal group's motive for responding to a situation. And we found a very helpful way of describing drivers is with a brief statement explaining what's happening and what's needed. And you can break that down a bit by looking at what's the actual situation, the effect on the organization of that situation, the organizational need, and the impact of responding to that need. And I think the need statements from SOFA are also pretty much in that direction and cover those bases too. And I think there's probably a reason for that, because we have a similar influence in the background. And I'm hoping, yeah, that's the next slide here. So there's a direct correlation between S3 and nonviolent communication. this wasn't deliberate, actually. It just came about as we were defining S3 and what it was, and we noticed that we have a pattern called navigate via tension, and Rosenberg spoke about being aware of your feeling and connecting to that and communicating it. And our feelings or tension brings our attention to something. And Rosenberg spoke about the observation, and we speak about being clear on what's happening objectively. There's a need, and in S3 we talk about the organizational need, and in MVC we're looking at the request of the other or ourselves, and obviously relating to organizational needs, we need to develop strategy to deliver value to those and to bring about the future that we would hope to see. A couple of final things. So the patterns are the optional compatible patterns approach, I think, is quite unique to S3, and took me a while to get my head around that. But I see the value, and people can utilize them on an as needed basis. The potential for leadership is completely distributed among every individual within clearly defined domains. And S3 is compatible whether you're talking about hierarchy, or bottomarchy, or self-organization, and or a combination of all. And often a combination of all is quite useful in terms of thinking about how information and influence is flowing through the system. And finally, S3 offers specific patterns for governance and operations, along with several other dimensions. And that brings me to the end of this presentation, and I'm just going to come out of my screen here and see if I can get back to you folks. Stop sharing. There's not much time for questions, and I'm so sorry about that. I didn't test the presentation. I finished it 5 minutes before I joined you. But is there one or two before I wrap up?
James, are you reading the comments? There's some questions in.
In a previous session, John Buck mentioned that engineering principles are somewhat lost in S3. What do you think? I think I'd need to understand what he meant by the engineering principles, but I mean, yeah, I really don't know what to say to that without thinking about it a bit more and understanding specifically what he thinks. But SCM is fully embraced within S3. You can do everything in SCM and it still falls within the embrace of S3. We didn't kind of chop anything out except operational leader as a mandatory pattern, I think. So could you please explain in more detail the difference between vision and driver? Yeah, sure. So vision is like, vision can come through an individual, or it can come through a group, through a co-visioning process, and it's a endeavor to describe or picture a dreamed of or desired future, and to bring it into the now and to then steer towards manifesting that. So driver doesn't have to discount vision. But if you think of a driver statement, it begins by asking what's happening. So let's say, Francine, you're a visionary. It would begin by, Francine has had a vision, and it goes something like this, yeah? And the effect of that is, and we're motivated to realize this. Yeah? And what's needed is to combine our capacities, to evolve, to collaborate towards seeing how this vision can be realized, yeah? In order to learn what does and doesn't work, for example, yeah? So the thing about that is we regularly evaluate drivers, and so it's useful to go back to that driver on a regular basis and check, is that still the vision? Have things changed? Is the way the world is manifesting as a consequence of our actions measuring up to the vision or not? And what I've seen with a lot of organizations is they get fixated on vision, and the original motivation for that organization is more or less clear, and people can invest their lifetimes trying to realize a future that they believe is the most appropriate, but it more or less often actually delivers value to the original need that they wanted to respond to. And so, not discounting vision in any way. And the other thing people often ask about purpose, what's the difference? Well, purpose is implicit. Purpose is deliver value to the driver, whatever that may be. And you can describe that in as glamorous and engaging, or as in mundane and concrete terms as you like. So nothing's discounted, but in that sense, driver is a distinct value proposition, and it's a concept that I believe is always there at the root of all human action. And I think, folks, that brings me absolutely on the time. I don't want to into the next person's time slot. But thank you so much. Really great to share with you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.